So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome you at the premises of CERGI, a joint workplace of the Academy of Sciences, its Economic Institute, and CERG, which is part of Charles University. I repeat it so that it becomes known that CERGI are two institutions in one. My name is Daniel Munich. I work at think tank IDEA, academic think tank IDEA, which is a virtual entity within CERGI. I welcome also those who are online. And before I will introduce our great speaker here, I have some technical announcements, some reminders, and some kind of academic advertisement. So please be patient for few minutes only. I already mentioned think tank IDEA, and within IDEA, we have a long-term joint project with RSJ Foundation to support research and everything related research on gifted children or even adults. We don't care much, but we focus primarily on children because it's best to invest early in life. RJ Foundation has a broader agenda, not just research, but is supporting many other agendas related to gifted children. So I recommend to go to browse online and you can find details. I will just remind that we already published a critical literature review on what economists and related researchers did worldwide on researching gifted children. It's in Czech, short version, and extended version in English. You can download it from our website already. And we are preparing two new empirical studies which will appear soon, definitely in spring, maybe even during the winter. One will focus on math talented children based on data from the well-known PISA survey. It will be probably the first ever comparative study focusing on gifted children in math only. And the other will be meta-analysis of how interventions to support gifted children are evaluated. It will be very closely related to what we will hear today. So if you miss some points, there will be a study, a review study, which will bring back what is being done, has been done in the world on this. Today's study will be on the effectiveness of advanced economic programs. I will still postpone the introduction of our speaker here. The program is presentation for about 50, 60 minutes, depending on if there are some tough questions during the presentations. Then we expect the question and answers part, including our online guests. We have a chat, so we prefer if you put questions into chat. We can't here in the hall, cannot see the chat, but once there are some questions, we'll see them. This means that there is one person you cannot see, but he is watching closely. It's Jakub. He's our audiovisual operational manager who is sitting behind and who muted everybody online. But if needed, he can allow you to speak online. So this time to introduce our great guest here, who is Scott Iberman.
Imperman.
Iberman from the US. It means that we still have many good friends and colleagues in the US, despite what's happening on the political side. It's great. He's coming to us from, he's working at Michigan State University, where he's professor of economics and education policy. You see that I can't remember details, so I read them. That's my disadvantage from early ages. And he got PhD at the University of Maryland in 2007, just to get background. Important is that he, if you look at his research part of his website, he did many studies related either to gifted or disadvantaged children or teachers who are teaching these. These are very interesting studies. And in fact, one reason why we have this long-term project is to foster the understanding that research on this is important, even in Czech Republic. So that this is an example of how much research is being done in the US. Of course, Scott is not the only one who's doing research there. Do not ask questions on the Czech system, the Scott. So,
I mean, you could try. I can try to answer best I can. I'll just say something random if you ask about that. How about that?
But definitely don't hesitate to ask anything on the US. Despite that US is big, and we had nice presentation his presentation, academic one yesterday on okay, I will not go into detail from Texas, right?
Yeah.
Texas is 30 millions. So it's something like 3 times Czech Republic. So they have many Czech Republics there in the US. So I will just mention a couple of his recent or his more recent papers. Recruiting and support low-income high achievers at flagship universities. Educational evaluation and policy analysis forthcoming. Is it still forthcoming? Or
I think that one is out, yeah.
this might be very useful to read if it's out already. Are effective teachers for students with disabilities effective teachers for all? That's, of course, another parental skills, assortative mating, autism, and so on. And gifted children, is it a bright idea? Or, sorry, I should go slowly. Is gifted education a bright idea? The answer is in the paper, right?
Yes, yeah. I'll talk about that one a bit,
Okay.
yeah.
So, I finished, and I welcome our dear guest, and the floor is yours, and
Great.
feel here.
Yeah, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Hi everyone, welcome, and it's great to see so many people here with all this interest. Just so you know, I'm a teacher, and so I like to teach. I like to interact. I like to when I teach my students, I want them to kind of interrupt me and kind of ask questions. So we're gonna have question time at the end, but if you have burning question or anything you kind of wanted us to ask about, including the Czech system, even though I might just, like I said, I might just say just completely random stuff that I don't know anything about. Please do, raise your hand, interrupt. I like to have these kind of things be interactive. It's also kind of just the economist way. For those of you who've ever been to an economist academic research workshop, we kind of tear into each other a little bit. I don't want you to tear into me, so please don't. But we kind of go have like lively back and forths, and something kind of we try to bring to the classroom too. So I hope this is an opportunity to have kind of like a, as I talk about this stuff, a lively back and forth discussion. Right, so I think maybe I might start kind of giving a little bit of background, just kind of like where my interests in this as kind of about both gifted students and, as Daniel talked about, kind of students with special needs. And it comes from my family. I have my older son has autism, and my younger son is probably too smart for his own good. And so, I kind of had these home experiences that I like to think kind of really inspired my research and my interest in looking into these questions. Because, I think as researchers, a lot of what we do gets inspired by our personal lives, and everyone kind of takes something from their background, something from where they are from, what they've experienced. We as researchers, we kind of, especially as economic researchers, because so much about economics is, for those if you're not really familiar with it, if you only kind of think of economics as being kind of like, oh, stock market, numbers, finance, it's not that anymore. I mean, maybe like 50 years ago it was, but really today economics is about understanding the human condition and understanding how humans interact with each other in social policies. And and so kind of our personal lives, I think, do really reflect a lot of what we look into. And with me, it's kind of this interest in education, this interest in through my own children, becoming interested in helping other children, and in helping improve the lives of people throughout throughout the world. Well, maybe that's a little bit too much. I'm not so sure how much of this stuff is helping people throughout the world, but to try to help improve the human condition in that way. And so that's kind of, I think, what inspired me here, and what got me interested in thinking about things like students with special needs, of which include gifted students and students with disabilities. So with that being said, let me start talking to you a bit about gifted student education or advanced academic education. And I'll start out kind of, doing the boring, Webster's dictionary defines as gifted as, no, not really that, but, kind of just so we're all on the same page. And before before I start there too, I also should say thank you very much to Daniel, Elena, and the people at Sergii and the people at the RSJ Foundation for supporting this work, for having me out here, and for just doing this wonderful work to really help the students of the Czech Republic. I think it's really awesome what you guys are doing. So I'm gonna go off of like kind of the U.S.-based definition. That's Daniel said a lot. Most of my work is U.S.-based, and so it's kind of going to be a lot of U.S.-based studies here. Students, children, or youth who give evidence of high achievement capability in areas such as intellectual, creative, artistic, or leadership capacity, or in specific academic fields, and who need services and activities not ordinarily provided by the school in order to fully develop those capabilities. That's probably a lot of words just to say smart kids. So if we kind of look at the statistics for gifted students, how many of them are there? In Europe, according to the European Commission, they're between 2% and 15% by country. I think Elena was telling me yesterday it's like less than that here, like 0.5% are identified as gifted in the Czech Republic. So pretty low, relatively low, particularly compared to the U.S., where there's actually I still not super high, but considerably higher rates of gifted and talented education identification in the U.S. So about 6.6% of students in the U.S. are enrolled in these gifted education programs. But just like Europe, where you have like kind of very wide variety across EU countries, in the U.S. you also have like a wide variety across states. And if you look, it ranges from just 0.5% in the state of Vermont and 18.5% in Maryland. And I think that a lot of that's because despite that definition I gave you, it's actually a very loose definition. There's nothing really strictly that defines what a gifted student is and how to serve them. There's just so many different ways that schools and teachers go about trying to address the unique challenges that gifted students have. And so that just varies a lot, and especially state to state, and especially country to country. So what is it that schools tend to do, as far as I am familiar with, in order to serve gifted students? And I actually kind of hope that some people in the room maybe actually can kind of tell me a bit more about what's done here, in particular, and kind of how much in the Czech Republic things, may differ or maybe similar in how advanced education is handled. So one way is through accommodation in the regular classroom. So this can be just students in a regular general education classroom, but there's special things that they're done for them. They give projects, advanced coursework. Theoretically, this is what we're told is done for our younger child in his schools. I say theoretically because I'm not convinced it's actually done all that much, but I'm looking at my wife back there to confirm whether or not. So it's unclear. This is kind of in some ways one of the least able to kind of really measure what's going on because it's within the classroom. It's always, when you're kind of working with a lot of data when it comes to education, it's always really hard to measure what's going on in the classroom. You can kind of see where a kid is placed in the class, what class they're placed into, what school they're placed into, what kind of services outside the classroom are assigned to them. But once they're in the classroom, it becomes a lot less clear. There's not much data that's collected about what's actually going on. And it's understandable, right? You don't want to put teachers in a position where they have to just be kind of marking off like certain pieces of data every 2 seconds. That there is some balance that's needed. But when we have these kinds of in-classroom accommodations, it's really hard to get a good feel for how much are actually being implemented. Are we just saying we're doing this, or is it actually happening? Another way, and the way that's kind of easier to see, is assignment to a special class. And this can be done in 2 ways more generally. One is through what's sometimes called a pull-out regime. You have special times that you're removed from the regular classroom and put into a gifted class environment. This might be like a period the equivalent of a period of a day, or maybe 1 day a week, and the students do their more advanced coursework, or they do special projects or things like that. Alternatively, and perhaps kind of the most substantial service provision, and probably also the most controversial, is full-time self-contained, where basically the students are in a completely separate gifted class. And I actually had the opportunity, again, this kind of to experience this from my personal experience when I was a child. I was in a gifted and talented program where I was lucky enough to have a pull-out class where it was very advanced academics, and we're all in the same classroom. And as I'll tell you in a bit, there's some good theories and some not so great evidence for why this might work well. But it is certainly the most substantial. But at the same time, and you can kind of see that you see kind of a similar story when you're thinking about students with disabilities. When you're looking at disabled students, there's talk about inclusion, like having them in the classroom, interacting with the general education kids. And you can have a kind of a similar story when it comes to gifted kids, right? Is it good to keep them separate from the general education kids? In part because you want students to have a wide variety of other students that they're exposed to. You want them to kind of see, in a sense, like who their peers are, and to kind of have a variety of peers. But at the same time, that's offset by you also may want to be able to specialize instruction. You may want to be able to have the high achieving peers kind of be able to work off of each other, to kind of build up each other in that way. And so it is a tricky thing to think about what's best here. And of course, when we start thinking about things like these peer effects, you also have kind of the reverse situation where, if you think of having a high achieving student is good for the lower achieving students, right, you're kind of losing something on the other end if you're just taking them out of the classroom altogether. And so it is a big question as to what's the balance there, right? And we don't have, and I'm not going to have an answer for you, unfortunately. I'm sorry. We don't, there's no such thing. And again, kind of talking in economics terms, economists, we try to think in terms of like optimality, right? Like what's the way that we can maximize something, that we can make something as big as possible, right? And sometimes I don't like to get into this mindset because I think it's a misleading mindset when it comes to education. That because there's just so many different things that go into what an education does and what it does for children. But sometimes I do kind of do some thought experiments in the economic thought process, which is say, okay, well, how do we maximize something like achievement, right? And part of the justification for looking at things like how peers influence each other, these which we call peer effects, is to say, well, is there a way we can sort students into different classrooms, into different environments, that's going to make our total achievement as big as possible, right? That's kind of the simplest kind of economic question. And but like I said, there's other things that go into that. So it's something that it's like one of those things that you kind of use for motivation, but you don't necessarily want to use the actual policy. But in the end, we don't have an answer for that policy anyway, at least not yet. We don't have this is a way to kind of optimize how to place, say, gifted students in different classrooms. Although we do have a little bit of information on that, but nowhere near where we would want to be. So that's kind of I think the big controversy with that, kind of the idea that the self-contained classroom is somewhat exclusionary. And then there's a lot, and this is particularly in higher grades, once you get to middle school, high school, is accelerated courses. So for example, taking math at a higher grade level. Yeah.
Just clarification question. When you say achievement, what do you mean?
I'm sorry, I mean like test scores, like standardized tests or grades or things like that.
Because there's a lot of discussion in labor economics that, it's not about cognitive skills, it's about non-cognitive skills.
Right, yeah, no, that's...
Or careers, so that's why I'm asking what do you mean by achievement?
Yeah. So, well, yeah, when I'm saying achievement, I'm talking about tests of cognitive skills. Yeah. But yeah, that's right. And so and that's part of the reason I think it's not everything, right? That there's all these other skills that people get. These, and again, another thing I hate is the name non-cognitive skills because it's so broad. But maybe you've heard of things like grit or ability, or like a ability to kind of take control of your surroundings, and also things that we kind of think of as social skills, like ability to interact with the others, to network, to empathize with others. Those are all things also that get built up in the schooling environment, and I think are also important in terms of determining, whether these education interventions more generally, and especially in these kind of advanced education interventions, what impact they have. But so that's something that's going to be floating out there. But yeah, when I say achievement, I'm talking about the, how well you do on things like math, reading, things like that. Yeah, so then you have the accelerated courses, or as one possibility, or sometimes grade advancement. I think I don't know how it's done, how much that's done in Europe. In the U.S., grade advancement, which is kind of skipping a grade, that's something that kind of actually fell out of favor a number of years ago. So you don't see much of that going on anymore. But you do see within grade kind of acceleration, where they'll kind of like, give you like more advanced math or more advanced reading, but you're still kind of in the same peer. And that was kind of a peer group story, right? Where there's the idea that it's probably beneficial to be amongst peers of your same age level. And sometimes also particularly in upper grades, though sometimes elementary, you may have separate schools. And these are things like advanced academic magnet schools, kind of specialized high schools that are for specifically advanced students. And those are typically in kind of, I tend to see those, at least in the US, in more urban areas. There's some really well-known ones, at least across the U.S. And maybe even well known enough that they've been made their way over to Europe. Like there's some schools in New York City or Boston. I don't know if maybe if someone could tell me if they've ever heard of like the Stuyvesant High School or the Boston Latin School. No, okay, I got a couple nods actually. Okay, good. Yeah, so some of those kind of make their way over. And those are kind of those like really advanced high schools. And then there's actually this thing that goes on in the States, actually now it's pretty popular and it's become a lot more common, is this dual enrollment with local colleges, where high schools will have, essentially the school districts in the state will pay for students in high school to take classes at like kind of a local college or university, if they're in like, advanced high school students, to give them an opportunity to get college credit while in high school, and to kind of also kind of shore up their own academic portfolio for when they apply for college. So that's become a pretty popular thing for across the country, I think. Let me pause there as well. Any questions so far? So before I get into kind of what we know in terms of the empirical research, I want to say a little bit about some of the underlying theory for kind of why, what economics is behind GT intervention, right? And to kind of give you a feel for what economists I think can contribute to the discussion about gifted and advanced academics. And so I'm going to start out with this thing I've been alluding to for a little while, this idea of peer effects. So peer effects is basically, and sometimes some people call it social interaction effects, but it's basically about who a child or an individual, it's not, peer effects happen with everyone, adults too, but in our context, a child, who they interact with, and and particularly in a more simpler phrase, who they're friends with, who they hang out with, who are their not so much friends, who are the bullies, right? Who are the people who have negative peer effects on them. And so basically, it's trying to understand how, for example, Jane here influences Josie, and how Josie influences Jane. They kind of both influence each other. And this, we think, has sizable impact on how much students learn cognitively. And indeed, there's also evidence about non-cognitive peer effects, particularly some stuff when you're thinking about students who are disruptive in school can have substantial negative effects on other students, both inside and outside the classroom. As well as actually lots of peer effects and things like kind of risky behaviors, like drinking and things like that. Of course, any parent of a teenager kind of knows that there's these things that kids get in trouble with, and that their friends get them in trouble. So, right, that's kind of the story that's age old. So, and so the issue that we have here, and I'll give you an example, and I'm going to get into an example from some research I've done previously. So Jane and Josie are friends, and we think that they influence each other. But you have to, and that influence maybe they're both high achievers, and so that they're increasing each other's achievement, right? They're increasing each other's grades in school, their test scores. And the problem is that we don't know how much of Jane and Josie's high achievement is because they met each other and they started influencing each other, or because they were already high achievers and that's why they met and became friends. And this is actually one of the fundamental problems when the economists really think a lot about, especially, you know, and when it comes to all sorts of questions, but especially when it comes to questions of education and education policy, is this issue of what are we missing that's potentially driving what we see? What are these kind of unobserved missing effects? So what we see here, oops, yeah, this thing not, oh, there it goes. What we see here is that Jane has a high achiever and Josie's a high achiever. So your immediate thought is like, okay, well, Jane and Josie are increasing each other's achievement. But what actually we don't see is that they were already high achievers and that they met because of that. So can we say that Jane is causing Josie to be a high achiever? Not really, because it could just be that happened to be that because they met, that's what happened. Because they met because of this high achieving. And there's plenty of other examples, like throughout all sorts of questions, where this issue of, you know, trying to establish cause and effect becomes very difficult because you can't separate out how much of it is actually the pattern you're trying to look for, and how much of it is something that's hidden that's influencing both of the people involved, or all the people involved. So what we like to do as economists is sometimes we try to find what we call natural experiments. And I like this term a lot because the way I try to think about it is, like, there's some economists who actually do real experiments. You know, there are people, and non-economists too. I should be clear. Actually, there's some researchers more broadly who do real experiments. You know, and these are actually social experiments. So we're not talking about, you know, lab rats running around in a maze in a lab. It turns out, unfortunately, research ethics prevent us from allowing us to put people in the maze to run around in a lab. I don't know why, but, you know, okay, fine, if you're going to put rules on it. But, whoops, sorry. But essentially, these are social experiments. They're kind of trying to get people to do certain things that you want them to do to see what the impacts are. And the key part of that is that you're going to randomly try to get people, you know, give people some incentive or give them some access to something that that will induce them to do something. So, in an ideal situation, you know, maybe, well, I'll talk about that in a little bit, but just kind of preview. Like in an ideal situation, maybe if we want to look at something like gifted education, we could randomly assign people to be gifted and, you know, to be in the gifted education program. That's turns out to be a lot harder than you think it is. And I'll explain a little bit later why. But a natural experiment is something that happens in the real world that replicates an experiment. That we can kind of say, oh, this is something that kind of gives us quasi-random or some partial randomness, or sometimes fully random allocation of some policy to someone or some intervention that happened in the real world. And you just have to look in the data for it. You have to look historically for it. So I'll give you this example, and this is something useful in peer effects, because what we want to do in the peer effects, if I go back a bit here, right, is we want to somehow figure out a way that we can make Jane and Josie friends without them both being high achievers initially. That, like, we could just say, let's figure out some way to get Jane and Josie to meet randomly. You know, I don't know, put them into like a situation where they're just, like, you know, playing in the park or something. You take a couple kids, you just throw them into the park, and then you'd see who becomes friends afterwards. Something like that, right? Like that's a way that you can then kind of get at these peer effects, because that introduction of that random meeting of the two people. And so what we did in this study is we actually had a different random meeting of people, which was based off of Hurricane Katrina, which hit New Orleans, Louisiana, and the rest of the Louisiana coast in 2004. And so the idea here was, so what happened was Hurricane Katrina was a Category 3 hurricane, hit New Orleans. New Orleans is famously below sea level. So it's very easy to flood, or at least it was at the time. They've built better dikes now since the hurricane. But essentially, large chunks of the city became completely flooded and unlivable. And there was a mass evacuation from New Orleans, and also some other cities nearby, particularly Lake Charles over here had a mass evacuation after basically 2 weeks later, Category 4 Hurricane Rita hit in the western part of Louisiana. So it was actually kind of a bit of a 1-2 punch. And so all these families, they moved out of Louisiana, or they moved out of New Orleans to other parts of Louisiana. A lot of them moved to Texas. And we had this idea that like, a lot of these were school-aged kids. And all of a sudden, you had these schools that had to absorb a whole bunch of new students. And these students would have varying ability levels, varying backgrounds, right? It's as if you took a bunch of Josies and you plop them into the park with a bunch of Janes, and then you just see what happens, right? That they're just kind of end up being just spread across the state of Louisiana. And here, this is Houston, Texas, where we also looked in across the city of Houston and other parts of Texas. And these people show up at these schools, and then now all of a sudden you have a different peer group. And so that's where we get that natural experiment. It would kind of experiment quasi-randomly, putting all these people into these schools. And if you're a student who's already at school in, say, Houston, all of a sudden you have this whole set of new peers. And so what we found in this paper, that we found evidence for peer effects that were modestly sized, and we found evidence that higher achieving peers increases one's own achievement. So your test scores go up if your peers have higher test scores, or higher, have better grades, higher test scores, which it might seem obvious, but it's actually not. There's actually a whole lot of questions as to whether or not that's actually the way it works. And though we didn't look specifically at GT, I think it highlights the idea that these peer effects can be important, and we think that they can be important in the GT context. Something I'll talk about a bit later when I get to the other studies that are more focused on advanced academics. Another way that you can think about the economics behind GT interventions is to think of targeted instruction. There's theories that teachers target the median student in the classroom, so the student who's kind of in the middle, right? Which makes sense, right? If you're going to try to figure out what level to teach at, you kind of say, okay, this is the middle student, and then I'm going to kind of aim at that, and then hopefully people on either side are going to, at least absorb some of it. And I say this is a theory. It's maybe more of a hypothesis because I don't think there's actually any evidence for this theory. So maybe it's a hypothesis. But it is, I think, a good way of thinking about why targeted instruction could be helpful. Because if the teacher is targeting kind of the median student and you're a high achiever, a very high achiever, you may find the material to be, pretty much below your level, right? It might be too easy. If you're a very low achiever, it might be too hard. And so if you took the same classroom, for example, let's say you had two teachers and they were both, like, students were randomly assigned across classrooms, so the teachers were targeting both the median, in the entire school. And, and then from both those classrooms, right, the high achievers, things are too slow for them, the low achievers, things are too fast. But then if you split those out into two separate classrooms where all the high achievers were in one classroom and all the low achievers were in another classroom, or essentially where you track them, which I know that there's a lot of that done in the Czech Republic, then potentially the teachers can target better because now the high achievers have a higher target level and the low achievers have a lower target level, right? And so, that's kind of the underlying theory behind that. The downside, as you might be able to see, kind of glean from that when mixing it with the peer effect story, is that in some cases that could be detrimental from peer effects, right? That if you have, particularly on the low achiever, we think maybe particularly on the low achiever side, right? That if you have put all the low achievers in one classroom, you don't have any, and we think that peer effects work by the high achievers lifting them up. You don't have any high achievers there to lift them up, and so they may end up doing worse. And it's hard to separate. So it's hard to separate those two things. It's hard to kind of separate out how much peer effects matter, how much the target instruction does. But when you combine them, at least it does suggest that tracking may be beneficial for gifted students. And we'll see some of the evidence. Although I think the evidence for that is also pretty mixed in the end. But let me give an example of where this really kind of comes out very clearly. So there's a paper done by Duflo, Dupas, and Kramer in Kenya. in 2011. And it was really kind of this ingenious experiment where they basically took a bunch of schools, and in Kenya the schools are very small. They're like maybe, maybe something like 100 students, two classrooms, sometimes only one classroom. But at least in the schools that had two classrooms in them, they randomly assigned a school to have either the students randomly assigned across classrooms so that what the student abilities were was pretty much equal across the classrooms and that they were a mix of students from both of them. And some schools that were tracked, where they took basically the highest, they gave all the students a test. They said, you scored highest on the test, you're in classroom A. You scored lower on the test, you're in classroom B. And this is basically what it looked like with the test scores, right? You have the average test score of a student's classmates, and if you're in the school where they separated them out, right? If your own test score was below the median, you had all these classmates with low test scores. If it was above, you had all these classmates with high test scores. If you're in the school where all the students were randomly assigned, everyone pretty much on average had the same set of peers, at least according to the test score. So it was this really nice, this was not a natural experiment, this was an actual experiment. It was this really nice, clean experiment where they're able to look at, okay, well, what's the impact of doing this tracking, and is it the case that targeted instruction that you might get out of this could overcome negative peer effects? And it actually turns out in their case that was the case, that the tracking actually did quite a bit to improve the students' outcomes for both the low achieving and the high achieving students. So if you look up here, this is a figure from their paper. The dotted yellow lines, maybe not the dotted yellow ones are the track schools, and the hollow red ones are the non-track schools. But you could also look at the lines here that kind of just kind of smooth those out. So the blue line is for the track schools, the dashed red lines for the non-track, and you can kind of see at every point, no matter what your starting achievement was, your ending achievement was higher if you were in the tracking school than a non-tracking. So that means for both the low achievers and the high achievers. And I think this is kind of one of the best evidence we've had that this kind of tracking does seem to improve students' education, cognitive outcomes, notwithstanding we don't know as much about what's happening to their non-cognitive outcomes. And there's been some other studies on tracking. I think using a variety of techniques. I think in general it does seem to find that the tracking works. But as I'm going to show you, the one place where it seems like maybe it doesn't work so well is unfortunately with gifted students, which is kind of, I guess, I wouldn't call it ironic, but different maybe. The third thing that I think you can kind of think about how the economics works behind GT interventions is just curricular enhancements, right? We know that things are done differently in GT/advanced class environments. There's adjustment to curriculum. The class curriculum presumably is made harder for them, more advanced. You kind of speed things through. This includes condensing and streamlining to do less review of previously learned materials. Accelerated learning, so by advancing a portion of it or all of the work at a grade level. So like, my youngest son right now, for example, is in 6th grade and he's taking 7th grade math, right? So that's kind of a clean example of that. More project-based learning, especially trained and certified teachers. So at least in the US, most states have a special gifted certification. It's not clear, again, how much it does, but it's there, and presumably there are certain pedagogical methods that they learn in order to improve gifted education. So that's kind of, and I don't think I have that much, to talk about the evidence of that, because I think it's kind of there's not really, I think, that much good evidence on these specific curricular impacts, but these are kind of some of the things that certainly are used in order to try to improve gifted students, and theoretically, we think should have positive impacts on them. Okay, so that's kind of the background. That's trying to get you to think about how economists might think about these questions in advanced academics and the things that we worry about. So now, how do we assess this? And I'm going to tell you a bit about kind of what, again, I mentioned a bit before, that we really are concerned about trying to get at what's the cause of these things. What's the causal path that gets us from a policy intervention to outcomes to improvement of education. And I took this quote from a book by Richard Murnane and John Willett, Methods Matters. And actually, this is not their quote. This is actually a quote that they had of someone else, which is when the U.S. Institute for Education Sciences, which funds a lot of education research, at least at the moment, I'm going to hope it continues to. When it was first established in 2002, they polled a lot of policymakers and a lot of school leaders, superintendents, state policymakers, and they asked them kind of what are the priorities. And this one person said, whereas the priorities of educators depend on their responsibilities, I'm sorry, not the one person, but what they say is, whereas the priorities of educators depend on their responsibilities, the striking commonality in the responses was that practitioners and policymakers at all levels want to know the answers to questions of cause and effect. They want to know if A caused B. And, right, because I think if you think back to, before back into like the 1990s and before the 2000s, really, almost all educational research of a quantitative nature was purely correlational. That it was basically saying, look, we know these two things have a relationship, but couldn't say anything about whether A caused B. And this is, I think, where economists came in and kind of said, when we started looking at the education issues, we kind of started saying, hey, we have some ways we think that you can start to say A causes B. Now, granted, I don't think we were as nice about it as we should have been, but we're nicer about it now. And now, actually, today, I think the state of education research, particularly education policy research, is vastly improved because now you have so many strict education policy researchers, like non-economists, not just economists, but all sorts of education policy researchers who are very careful about thinking through how do you figure out causal effects, and also whether you need to do a causal analysis, and if you're not, being open about what it is. And I'm really kind of happy that that's kind of the kind of the norm that's kind of developed in that field. And it's kind of developed to the point where, like, I won't say they don't need economists anymore, but because I still want to have influence there. But that I would say a lot of them have adopted, a lot of policy researchers have adopted some of these tools and some of these ways of thinking, so that the ed policy research community, I think, is a lot richer. Even and the economists now sometimes play a smaller role because others have kind of taken up the mantle that we've tried to bring into it. So let me talk to you a bit about what this means in terms of advanced students. And what we call this is kind of like sometimes referred to as a fundamental problem of causal inference. And causal inference is just kind of thinking about statistics that tell us whether or not we can find a causal relationship, that A causes B. And it goes back to actually the same story I was telling about with like Jane and I forgot the second, Josie. What's the second name I know? I don't remember. What those two J names I used earlier. It's the same kind of question, the same situation, maybe a bit broader thinking. So okay, now I have two other students. So you see, here's John and here's Sarah, who are clearly not too young for first grade. But whoops, what happened here? Too young for first grade. But that was the stock photo I was able to get. And so John and Sarah have the same first grade test scores, and they're being considered for a gifted and talented class in second grade. Okay? And so the question you see is, if you're looking at the data, if you're a researcher or a policymaker looking at the data, and you say, okay, only Sarah got into the GT class. Why? They have the same test scores, but one got in and one didn't. Why is that the case? Now, sometimes maybe it's just random. Maybe it's just that, oh, we didn't have space, and so we can only pick one of them, so we just chose out of a hat. Now, by the way, as an economist, when I see that, I get excited, because that means like, oh, I got randomness there. I could do some fun research. Maybe it's not the best way to actually do policy, though. So you got to balance those two things out. But you want to think about, normally what would happen is not, sometimes they actually do randomly. I've seen some situations where, like, for for some schools, right, if you get over a threshold test score, and then they'll randomly choose which students get into the school. But a lot of times it's more subjective than that. There are other factors at play. Maybe Sarah did better in her interviews. Maybe her grades are better. Maybe her teachers kind of had a recommendation and that they saw something in her that they didn't see in John. Or maybe Sarah had better first grade teachers than John. And so therefore her teachers were better able to pinpoint that she should be in a gifted class, right? So it's all these different other factors that end up being missed. And so if you kind of think forward, you kind of go forward a couple steps, and you think, let's say it's because Sarah's more active, more motivated. She works harder, and her teacher thought that is why she should be in there. And you fast forward a few years, and you say, okay, well, Sarah has higher test scores than John. I guess that means that the gifted program works, but no, not really. That doesn't necessarily mean that the gifted program works, because it could just be that Sarah was more naturally motivated than John. And her higher test scores are just reflecting that. And so this is the problem that we run into. There are these unobserved factors that affect entry into the advanced academics classes that we as researchers can't see, right? We can only see things, usually in the data you can't see it. You can't see, is this person more motivated in the data? It's just one of those fundamental things you just can't observe. There are other things maybe that theoretically you could observe, like if there's a teacher recommendation, maybe you could get access to those recommendation letters, and read them. But even that's really hard to do. But in that case, it's unobservable because it's there, but you can't access it. But in a lot of times, it's just completely unobservable. And so, what do you do in that situation? Because you want to get the answer, you want to figure out if the gifted program works, but you don't have the ability to do that. And so again, this is where we come back to trying to think about an experiment. And the ideal is, well, maybe we could just randomly put some students in advanced classes and other in regular classes. Now, like I said, great idea for economists, maybe not the best idea for a policymaker. First of all, of course, you can't make it completely random, because part of the nature of a gifted class is that the students are actually high achieving, right? So you can't just take a whole bunch of students and randomly put in one to one class and a bunch to the other class and call one gifted. Now, if you want to see some other questions, like what's the impact of certain curricular effects, then that's a different story. But for the actual package of gifted education, that's not going to work. There are some things maybe you could do. Like I said, I've seen some cases where there's you take a test score, and then if everyone who gets above a certain score could get in, and then if there's more people getting above that score than you have space for, then you could randomize who gets in there, and that could be kind of a type of a gifted class. And that's like one way they could theoretically do it. But doing an actual experiment, of course, is super hard. Because there's just that narrow set of circumstances where it's feasible. And then also, it turns out that doing experiments is a lot of work and very expensive. Now, it's great work if to do it. I think I've done it once, and I think I swore never to do one again. So I'm more of a let me just look for the right data kind of a guy. But it could, because it is very time consuming. It's very logistically difficult. It's very financially expensive, and that maybe it's the last one that's really the big kicker. Like usually to do field experiments, it costs a lot of money to be able to do them right, and then you gotta have to figure out someone to give you the money to do it. So when you don't have that, what you really want is, again, a natural experiment. You want to find something that is going to occur in the real world that's going to replicate what you actually do. Now, this is a lie, because I came up with this quote a week ago, so the date's wrong here. But I ran out of other people's quotes, so I decided just to do my own. So there you go. If you can't do an experiment, go out and find one. I do actually tell this to my students, so it is fair. Yes, please take pictures of my own quote. I like that. My self-quote. So, and this is actually, I think, so now I'm going to get into the meat of the matter. I think I said I was only going to take 50 minutes, and I think I lied about that. Sorry. And now I'm going to get to the meat of the matter and talk about kind of what we have actual evidence on, because we do have some evidence from these natural experiments here. And so so in the advanced academics literature, what we really do often try to rely on is this idea. It turns out to be pretty convenient that a lot of admission to advanced classes or advanced schooling environments involves some sort of a threshold, right? It's usually a test score or some combination of factors where you have to get above a certain score in order to get in. And this gives us a huge advantage because what it does is it allows us to say, hey, someone who's just above that threshold is for all intents and purposes pretty much identical to someone just below. If you have a test score, if you have a test on like a scale of 1,000 and the passing score is 500, is someone who gets a 501 really all that different from someone who's a 499? Not really. It's virtually the same. Most likely, the only difference there is some random bad thing happened that day. I don't know. They sneezed over one of the tests, the bubbles, and it didn't fill out or something. That's actually a horrible example. I don't know why I would use that one. Usually people use the dog barking in the background, but I want to be a little more creative. So that's kind of the thing we use, and there's actually a term for this. I can give you the technical term. It's called regression discontinuity. You don't need to worry about that. But the idea is basically, look, we can kind of just compare these people near the threshold and say, hey, some of the people for pseudo-random reasons got just above the threshold and get into this gifted program, and some of them for pseudo-random reasons fell just below and didn't. And so there are a few papers that actually try to do this, and I think do it pretty well. One of them, kind of going back to what I said before about these specialized advanced high schools. And so this was a paper by Abdulkadiroglu, Engris, and Pathak, where they're looking at those exact New York City, Boston high schools that I mentioned before. They're pretty well known in the U.S. A couple of the top high schools in the U.S. Stuyvesant High School for Math and Science, and the Latin School in Boston. These are kind of reputed to be some of the best schools in the country. And so essentially, right, you have this threshold thing. There's actually standardized exams that are used to get into these schools. And so here's a figure from their paper that shows enrollment in the Boston schools. They call them exam schools. And you can see that enrollment jumps right at that threshold. So they're attending other schools. And then if they get above the passing score, a whole bunch more people end up going to the specialized school. And it's that sharp jump that says, look, basically these people have the opportunity to go to this O'Brien school here, and these people don't. These people have the opportunity to go to Latin Academy here, and these people don't. And so there's that big jump in the likelihood of attending a specific school. So what does that do? Right, so if we can get this big jump going to these specialized high schools, so we would think, okay, great, we can get these two types of people who are virtually identical. We can compare what are their outcomes in those high schools compared to the people who end up going to other high schools. And in the end, what they find is that there's basically no impact on achievement score, on test scores. You can see here, even though we had this big jump in the likelihood in the people on the left who attend, wrong button, who attend, say, the Latin School or the Latin Academy or O'Brien, which is the other special high school. These people, most of these people are attending the special high school, most of these people are not, and their test scores are almost identical. So that's not a great thing for advanced academics, right? That's kind of saying, well, there wasn't really any impact at all. What about in New York? In the New York high schools, it's the same story. So here you had a whole bunch of more people going to these Brooklyn Tech, Bronx Science, Stuyvesant. These are all, by the way, very math, science heavy high schools that are really advanced students, really high achieving students. Stuyvesant, for example, I think half the students go to Ivy League type colleges and things like that. It's really smart kids, and yet nothing, at least on their test scores. And this is despite, remember before I said, one of the big theories for why gifted and talented education might be helpful. So they don't have information on the curricular stuff, right? They can't look, there's not much they were able to do to look at that. But they could look at the peers, and they could see, hey, these guys have students who were scoring a lot higher on tests before they entered the schools. And so this is like this is what the average score of the students' peers are, and they jump up regardless of which school they go to. So you get these big increase in how good your peers are performing, and yet no increase in your own achievement. And so this kind of leads to a mystery, like why is that the case? But we have more evidence of this. So in a paper I did with a couple of colleagues back in 2014, we were looking at a gifted and talented programs in a large southwestern U.S. school district. And we kind of used the same idea to get at the causal effect. There was an admissions threshold. So that if you look, this is kind of like this chart that they use with a whole bunch of different points on different tests and things to kind of determine who was gifted. And if you got over a certain threshold, you ended up with being able to go into their gifted program. And it kind of looks like this. People below the threshold. Now, it wasn't perfect because there was some kind of we weren't able. There were some parts of the threshold that the scores that we couldn't really incorporate, so it wasn't 100%. But basically, right, some people. So maybe like 25% of the people just below the threshold were put into the gifted program, and about 80% just above, 75% just above the threshold were put in. So that's like a jump in 50 percentage points in the likelihood of being in a gifted program. So these people here. These people here, much more likely to be in the gifted program than these people over here. And what do we find? Same thing as Abdulkadiroglu et al. Nothing. We find no impact on the achievement. So, and at the time, basically ours were the only two papers that were really we were essentially kind of the first papers to kind of get at here's a causal effect of gifted and talented programs. And it was a little worrisome because we're like, yeah, here's the causal effect, and it's nothing. And right, if I'm trying to be dispassionate as a scientist and be like, yeah, that's what it is. It's nothing. Sorry, but obviously, people who are very invested in GT education and advanced academics, were quite concerned about this. Now, I do have a bit of good news, though. Later on, there was some work done by Card and Giuliano. Again, kind of a similar type of strategy. They were looking at, and one key thing I should note, by the way, so our paper was in middle school. Abdulkadiroglu et al. Was high schools. They're looking at elementaries. And so, and what we see, right, same story, get a big increase in the likelihood of enrolling in gifted program. And they actually finally start to see some things. And, maybe it's something about, the lower grades that are more effective. What they particularly see is they see large, sizable increases in achievement for minority students, so students who are kind of lower socioeconomic status, which in the U.S. education is a huge deal because particularly students who are Black and Hispanic races, these are students who are the least access to gifted education. And what they're saying here is like also they're the students who probably benefit the most. And so that becomes very important for like thinking about where the impact is the biggest, but also for equity of impact. Yeah.
Yeah, a few questions, but so one thing about this research is, to me, is strange that it assumes somehow that the agents, meaning the parents of the kids, are somehow passive in terms of how you react to the situation if you are below or above the threshold. So, being a parent, I know that I basically compensate things between siblings, right? I invest more into the one that is worse than to the one that is good. And similarly, if your kid is just below the threshold and you know that this is not end of this education process, you invest more to him. So this is one question to you, whether you have some data or some evidence that suggests what's the reaction of the families, because we as economists should think about it, right?
Yeah, no, you're right. And no, the short answer is no. There's not really anything, I think, that looks at the reactions of the families. So if what you're saying is happening, then that, so I guess what you could say is part of the lack of effect or the effect could be attributed to parents offsetting. So it is kind of like a package deal. So yeah, you could be a bit cautious in describing that entirely to gifted programs. Like, right, that if the gifted program is helping the kids above the threshold and parents below the threshold are investing more, then right, it's going to shrink. Right, it's going to give us like those zero results. Right, it's going to kind of shrink things. On the other hand, we don't have evidence on it. One could just as easily think that the investment might be bigger on the other side. Right, that either you do a compensating investment or you do reinforcing investment. Right, that you kind of invest more in the child who is going to be, you think is going to be more successful. And so I don't think it's obvious which way it goes. But you're absolutely right that that becomes a potential problem when interpreting what this means specifically for gifted programs.
Yeah, and my second question is, so there are many things that can happen below and above the threshold, right? So even if you find a positive effect, then it might be that the above the threshold, they receive more resources.
Right.
So meaning if these resources would be shifted below the threshold, you may get a better result, right? So that was my thinking also when you present this hurricane thing, that this is not only happening that happened, right? So they were relocated, and maybe the style of teaching has changed, right? All the resources that they're receiving has been changed, and then that's the reason why you get a positive peer effect, because simply they receive less resources, right?
Yeah.
So is there any way to empirically tackle this problem, or is it just for assumptions?
Yeah, no, it's. So, kind of, I don't want to dwell too long on like kind of like, our own paper and kind of what happened there, but that was an issue that did definitely come up when we were working on it. And I think it's really hard to do that. It's worth thinking about what kind of these other factors might be at play. And certainly there are some things, and which is why you always should be kind of a little cautious with that. There are other issues, by the way, with these studies that I'm going to get into in a second, which makes me throw, where I am going to throw some cold water on it. But those are good points too. But the short of it is, no, I don't think we do know what these kind of what's happening in these other possibilities are out there, and we kind of just do our best to try to get some sense of whether or not that is the case. I mean, in the hurricane case, they did, right, did get all this influx of students, and we were very worried about the strain on resources there. At the same time, they also got a lot more money temporarily in order to do those strain of resources. One thing we did see was that, like, for example, class sizes didn't change. They ended up hiring back a bunch of retired or temporary teachers in order to make sure that that they kept the class sizes the same while they had these extra students there. But of course, right, that's not the only thing going on, but that's at least one large, substantial part of that. So I think I'm starting to get on time. And so I guess I thought it was going to go slow. It always goes so much slower than I think it's going to be. All right, so reconciling the results, why did these things differ? Simplest explanation, different contexts. Maybe the GPT program's different, student populations respond differently. Another issue, like I was saying, it's like, another thing that I think is a substantial problem with these types of studies where you're looking at the threshold is that it only tells you about the students near the threshold. And so actually, what we're saying when we're saying there's no effect is we're saying there's no effect for students who are just on the margin of getting into the program. It's not really telling us anything about what's happening for the students who are really high achieving, and that we still don't have that good of a clue. The only clue I can kind of give you on that, which is in our paper with the gifted program in the Southwest School District. There was also one of these schools that I mentioned before, like some of these schools would have like a cap, like a lower limit, and then they would randomly assign, then they'd have, if you got above that threshold, you can go to that school, and then if they had more people applying who got in, they would be randomly assigned. So there were a couple of schools with that in that school district where essentially the students who got above the threshold were then randomly, if they wanted to attend this separate school, they were randomly assigned whether or not to get enrolled there. And that one we did at least see a little bit of achievement impacts in science. So there's a little bit, at least a little bit there. Another possibility is maybe that the test scores are just not the right outcome here, and this is always a problem with kind of thinking about economics of education research, especially in high achieving students. It's just the test scores are going to be maybe not targeted to them. They're targeted to a lower part of the distribution. So what are some of the other things? Well, right, we might think one big thing for gifted students is thinking things about college going. That's kind of like the first thought that maybe kind of crosses one's mind about what would be a successful gifted education is you get more kids into college, you get them to go to higher quality colleges. Fryer and Dobby looked at this at the same schools that Abdul-Qadiroglu et al. Looked at. Unfortunately, they don't see anything there for colleges either, for these standardized high schools, which is a little surprising. But maybe also, I think this is probably a lot of the story, is that interventions by the time you get to high school, in some sense, might be too late to have really big impacts, right? The earlier the intervention, the more years it has to kind of come into play, the potentially setting you on a very different path. So Carr, Giuliano, and Chin do show some evidence of this. So they see that in the middle school GT program, that improved high school graduation and college enrollment for boys, although not for girls, unfortunately. And Cohodes looked at Boston's upper elementary program, and she saw increased high school graduation and college enrollment. So it does seem like at least these earlier interventions, perhaps, and again, we're working on limited amounts of evidence, right? There's still a lot more, we only have a few case studies here. But these earlier interventions do seem to perhaps do better at these long-term effects, and really kind of what our ultimate goal would be, looking beyond simply test scores. So overall assessment on these advanced GT and advanced high schools, short-term impacts are mixed and better for minority groups. Long-term impacts are much more promising, particularly for programs below the high school level. I also wanted to mention really briefly just some of the stuff that we know about advanced college prep. There's a few studies that have looked at things like advanced placement / IB courses. There's, and there is some evidence that that access to these types of advanced courses do seem to improve high school outcomes. And although there is one situation where there's a Congress study to show that establishing new AP science courses in schools led to students have higher science skills but less confidence in their science abilities, which was kind of an interesting wrinkle there. Like they do better and then they feel worse about it. So it was kind of a bit of a mixed bag there. Okay, so I know I'm over time, but let me grab like maybe 10 more minutes just to talk real quickly about expanding access to advanced education. So before, all the other stuff I talked about before was about kind of the impacts of these programs. And another big question is like, how do we get more students to get access to these programs? And access can be pretty difficult to get, particularly for students in low socioeconomic status, or more specifically, students who are in schools and districts that are lower income and less wealthy, because these programs are expensive. And the screening mechanisms have flaws. They can be subject to both statistical bias. For example, lower SES students may perform relatively poorly on exams in a way that's not truly reflective of their abilities. And also taste-based. There may be discrimination, particularly against certain minority groups. So in a study I did for the Thomas Fordham Institute, we looked at high achieving students in the U.S. state of Ohio, and just kind of look at some trends as to what's happening with economically disadvantaged and racial minority students who are high achievers compared to high achievers who are from more advantaged groups. And some of the things that I saw there, in some sense are not too surprising, but were worth documenting. First of all, if you look, and this is kind of restricting to students who are in the top, I believe the top quintile achievement, top 20% of their third grade achievement rates. And you can see that the growth in achievement over time was much higher for the students who were not economically disadvantaged versus those who were, right? So these students are starting out relatively similar achievement levels, but they're going down a lot faster, with the income. Similar story with race, right? Relative to where they were. Unfortunately, they're all kind of losing, but relative to where they were, black students seem to perform worse. Again, these are already students who were initially identified as being high achievers. Let me skip this. One thing I do want to show from this is that when I did try to do some impact estimates using, I think, a relatively plausible causal design. And one thing I did find was that the impact of GT identification in Ohio was positive, but it was considerably larger for white students than for, I'm sorry, for black students than for white students. So again, kind of similar to what Cardin, Giuliano, and Chin find, or I think it was just Cardin, Giuliano. Cardin, Giuliano find where it's really the minority students who do better. You can kind of maybe make the same argument for Hispanics, but the estimates were not precise enough to really tease that out. So how do we increase access? Besides the obvious, which is spend more money. That's kind of always one of the solutions. Sorry, it's true. One thing that I'm a bit a fan of is expanded universal screening. The idea that traditionally GT students have been picked out by their teachers, by their school staff, right? And kind of just you pick out the student, you're like, oh, you think seems like you might be smart. Let's do some further testing on you and see if you qualify. Universal screening says, actually, let's reverse the steps. Let's do universal testing, and then from that group, see who qualifies, who might qualify with further inspection. And the idea here is kind of level the playing field to give everyone an opportunity to try to at least be considered for a GT program. And there is some evidence that universal screening can do a lot to improve participation of more disadvantaged groups in gift education. So a paper by Cardin Giuliano, this was a different paper by Cardin Giuliano, looks at a district in the large urban school district in the US that briefly had a universal screening program. Actually, they didn't have it, then they had it, and then they had budget cuts and they took it away, as such is the life of education, of being in education. But that actually did, again, one of these things where bad for the policy, but great for the economists. One of these situations where they actually had this, it was able to give this kind of this pseudo-random variation where they can now kind of look at what's the impact of providing that screening program. And ultimately what they found was pretty large increases in enrollment in gifted education, especially amongst minority groups. So black students were 2.4 percentage point increase, Hispanic students 4.2 percentage point increase, which by the way, this was a heavily Hispanic district, it was a southern district, so that's important there. While white students increased only 1.5 percentage points. So they all, the universal screening got more students into gifted, identified more students, but disproportionately identified more students from disadvantaged backgrounds. And that kind of was the key and why I think it could be a very useful thing to have when you're trying to expand access to gifted education. Of course, it's not a panacea, right? If you expand access and you don't actually do anything with it, I mean, you could always just call a student gifted and then not do anything. Maybe that helps a little bit, but probably unlikely that does all that much, right? You're not really doing anything there. So with expanded access still has to come, you have to provide the services, and you have to make sure that with the larger population that are being served, there's no degradation in the services there. So unfortunately, it still costs more money. Sorry, that's what happens in the end. So now I'm going to conclude everything. So what does it all mean in the end? After this exploration, you can come to a few conclusions, I think. First, the impacts of GT and other advanced academic programs are mixed, but largely I would say at least are not a net negative for students who participate. So it could be a positive. We're not harming them, so I think that's a good thing. Now that's not maybe all that satisfying, but I think there are some indications, especially for more disadvantaged groups, that this is it is effective having these programs. But you have to recognize for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. Maybe not equal in this case, it's not physics, but there is an opposite reaction. And so, right, if you're going to spend more and provide more resources to GT programs, that has to come from somewhere. Again, the money, the money matters. But also, I think ensuring access to people from all walks of life is important, and I think universal screening can give us a good chunk of the way there. It's not going to be everything, and again, the risk being that you have universal screening that increases participation without making sure the services aren't degraded is very key there. So thank you very much. It's been really great talking with you. I look forward to your questions, and also, if you have questions later, you can email me or talk to me on Blue Sky. So.
Thank you very much. We are not finished yet. We have questions and answers section as promised. So I call to the external online audience to use chat and Jakub to activate chat if there are questions. I offer the chance to ask questions. Let me make a note. I'm sure most of you who are familiar with local settings in Czech Republic have ideas how what was said here based on the US experience could fit here. What we do, what kind of questions. And the natural question which appeared to me immediately is the big issue of extended gymnasia. Šestiletá, osmiletá gymnasia. Should we keep them? Should we have more of them or should we close them? And do they really help pupils who enroll into them? What is nice is that these are extremely selective. They are using entry exams, very selective. We have data on all this, so we can nicely do this kind of analysis for the whole country. The problem is that the data are not made available for researchers yet.
Oh. I knew there was a catch.
So, the fact is that we know zero. We can debate for many years in the future. If we don't have data, we cannot answer it. I'm sure that we will get mixed results. It will depend on many things, right? Public, private, social background. It may depend on many things, but we should know something. Otherwise, the debate will be very simplistic. I'm for, I'm against. Okay, I don't know, I don't care. So this was just giving you time to think about your questions. So I don't see any questions yet on online. I guess that Jakub is watching closely. So let me open the floor here for those who are here. Please, just raise voice or raise hand, depending on how many. Yeah.
Thank you for the lecture. Can I ask you, for the nomination to the Gifted Children programs, do you mostly use the test scores, like results of knowledge, let's say knowledge, or more psychological knowledge? It's a huge difference.
Yeah, it differs a lot. Like at least in the States, it varies from frankly from school district to school district. I've seen some that use, things like intelligence tests, like the nonverbal, the Naglieri nonverbal ability tests. Some use the standardized achievement tests. The achievement tests, though, are not done typically in early enough grades. So usually those start around grade 3. So if you're in a program that's early elementary, it's much more likely, I think, to be kind of based more on the intelligence tests. But later on, I think they tend to use more of the achievement tests, in part because they already have to do those tests anyway, so it's cheaper.
Thank you.
So going back to Philip's question, so achievement may not be just the test scores, right?
Right.
So we've seen all these studies, especially the RGD studies, which show no impact, but just looking at the test scores, I guess, is there any new research which would look at other aspects of outcomes for these students? Because of course, when the high achievers interact among each other, it may not improve their test scores. It's all given in.
No, absolutely, yeah.
But maybe they're happier.
Yeah, no, that's true. No, so that's right about the happier part, and I haven't seen anything that's tried to look at these these kind of non-cognitive.
Or maybe there's a
things.
negative impact on their.
Yeah, no, it could be Well, like I said, there was that Conger study that did the AP exams, and that had the kind of unique thing where it's like they gave them access to AP science exams, and then the students were better. They learned stuff in science and they did better, but they lost confidence in science. So it's kind of like one of those things. I haven't seen anything that kind of has done surveys of kids, like, hey, are you happier? Are you depressed? Things like that. And I think that could be a really interesting avenue for future research in this. People have looked at, I think some of the studies here looked at some other kind of high school type outcomes, like ACT scores or ACT, the college entrance exam scores, or and you saw kind of high school graduation where it did seem to matter, and to an extent college graduation where enrollment where it did seem to matter. Those are not the same things as what you're asking, but I think that is kind of, I actually take those as being kind of the thing about the test scores, like I said, is that these tests are all targeted towards students. The way they're designed is they're targeted towards students in the lower part of the distribution, right? Because the goal of these tests, unlike kind of yeah, and this is different from the U.S., I think, than from a lot of European countries. European countries, you have a lot of these tests which are good, aimed for tracking, right? And so you're kind of trying to figure out which of these students are and should be in the high track versus kind of the lower tracks. And in the U.S., everything was kind of aimed towards what we call proficiency, like just basically being able to get above a minimum skill level. And so these tests are kind of targeted to students who I'd say are probably in like the 30th to 40th percentile, that range. And so they're not really good at discerning differences among students who are already in the 80th, 90th percentile, right at the top. And I think that's actually one of the main reasons why we didn't see these effects. I think part of it is that the tests are just not the best ways to measure this. And it's why I think you do see some, like in the Cohotas and the and some of the Card and Giuliano and Giuliano. I don't remember if it was Card and Giuliano, Card, Giuliano and Chin, but where you do see these impacts on college enrollment and in the high school. What was surprising to me, what is surprising to me, is that the lack of findings for the high schools, even on the college margin. And again, what that tells me is maybe there still are some things that are hidden that that are better. Like maybe the students are happier doing these things, like you said. We don't know. But what it does say to me is that for these gifted things, earlier intervention seems to be important. Like if you're doing an intervention in high school, at that point students are probably already on the path that they're planning to take, and it's a lot harder to move the needle. And I think we see that a lot in other types of interventions. Like I've seen things with I've seen studies about like kind of college interventions to get students interested and trying more likely to apply to college and things like that. And it does seem to be more effective when you start earlier as opposed to when you're starting when they're already like a junior in high school.
So I think that the rank issue can be actually pretty important as well. So Tomáš mentioned it just yesterday, because again, in these RDD studies, when you are the 500 run or just above the cutoff guy, so now you get into this great place with all the resources, but you realize how insufficiently smart you are because all these other guys are much.
Right, and that reminds me of another theory which I probably should remember because this is exactly something we talked about in our paper, which is that in some sense when you're thinking about the peers, there's potentially this offsetting effect. So we think that the peers, like having higher achieving peers, can improve your outcomes, but also there's this kind of, and I don't know if this is true on Translate well, it's in Czech, but it's called like the big fish, little pond theory. And so it's like a theory out of psychology. And for some reason, economists gave it a fancier name, which, I'm not going to bore you with what that is. But, the idea being, right, that if you're the top student in a class, you might be better positioned. Your teacher might give you more attention, you might be able to, you might have more self-confidence, things like that can help improve things. And then if you're in the bottom student of a higher achieving class, right, it's kind of the opposite effect. And so we had a theory in our paper that those two things kind of offset, right? That there's this big fish, little pond effect for these high achievers that's offsetting the usual kind of theory that higher achievers help you, having high achieving peers help you. And that also, I think, highlights the problem of these kinds of studies that look at the thresholds, because, right, you're only looking at those people who are on that margin. And so what we're really missing a lot of is really kind of what's happening to the people who are inframarginal, who are like at the top. So even if you took it like, you just chopped it in half, you chopped the gifted class in half, say the bottom half of the class are kind of these people who might be affected by that big fish, little pond effect. But the top half of that class, maybe they're doing a lot better. And we just don't know. And that's something we haven't been able to find a way to kind of tackle yet.
So Philip here and then...
I would like to ask you to comment this Czech academic tracking system what we have here, because I find it particularly stupid. So there is this like, so first of all, when the kids are 11, the selection process is based on the family decision making. So there's no universal screening before. So basically, it's based on the decision of the family, and then the process is, it's a public system, but still it's a high stake exams basically 2 round high-stakes exams, and these kids are 11 years old. And part of the story is also the grades that are feeding in the chances whether you are accepted or not. So one thing is whether it's good for the kids that get there, but the second thing is the selection process that is in place here. And if you can say a little bit about these high stakes exams
Yeah.
and potential difficulties.
Yeah. So, yeah, and I know that this is not an uncommon model, and particularly in Europe and in Asia. And the U.S. model is like kind of the opposite. Like U.S. is very kind of, in many ways, very against tracking. It's kind of there is a lot of push to have everyone kind of like when they get to high school being like college prep. I think in some cases to its detriment that there's not enough things like career and technical education available to people. But then there's kind of like this system, which is I don't know really what the evidence is on it. I admit I haven't. It's been a while since I've looked at a lot of the European tracking literature. I will say I think something about, and maybe this is now now I'm getting to the more like just kind of instinctual rather than rational economists look at it. But there's something about making an 11-year-old do something so high pressure and so making such a strong determination at that point in their life that rubs me the wrong way. I think that there is a need, and I don't know how rigid, like every country kind of has different ways in kind of how rigid it is in the system, like how easy it is to switch between tracks. So maybe, I don't know, if it's super rigid here or if it's, but I think like having ways for people who are kind of late bloomers to be able to take, to be able to be recognized and to be able to see that, I think is important. But I also think that these peer effects are real, and I think a lot of some of the lower achieving students lose a lot by not having exposure to higher achieving students, and that could also have societal impacts. I think it can have impacts in terms of like class structure and things like that, like a perpetuation of class especially inequality, class-based inequalities and things like that. So maybe I'm getting a little more philosophical than economic there, but that's kind of my view.
Because I mean, the structure is very rigid, not in terms of how you can change the tracks, the rigid also, but also the structure across the country. So basically, since we have 30 years of experiencing where young educated families are feeding or moving into the cities, the structure of high schools basically across the country is fixed. Now, this has also, of course, a huge impact on your potential, how you can get to the preferred school in this particular district, because if you live in somewhere in periphery, then it's basically easy for you to get to the academic track. If you are in a city, basically the chances are far lower.
Yeah.
So this is actually.
I think ironically
experiment, right? But huge social.
Ironically, there is actually a similar situation to that in the U.S. and it has to do with post-secondary education, actually in Texas, which we talked about yesterday, which is this top 10% rule, which is like where in Texas, to get into the public, basically if you're in the top 10% of your high school class, you're guaranteed admission to any of the public universities. It's kind of a similar kind of situation where I think where it's like, you're kind of, the certain high schools, and that's as intentional there, which is kind of the funny thing. It's like certain high schools, it's easy to kind of get into that top 10%, and certain high schools, it's really hard and highly competitive. And people do move and change their residencies to kind of game that system. So it's kind of it's actually ironic, interesting is that it's completely different intentions, but it ends up in kind of a similar type of place.
Okay, let me move to Anton.
And I suppose that the teachers at the schools with the children are on average better teachers, and moreover they are focused more on better students, and therefore that no causal effect was found seems to me contradict the finding in your other paper about the targeting.
Yeah.
Right. So it's counterintuitive for me.
I think it is. I mean, I guess, you know, I think you're right that it's likely that, you know, the teachers are going to be better teachers. I guess maybe the question is better at what? And maybe that's kind of the way to think of it. Like, right, again, it's kind of like we're looking at test scores. And like I said, the test scores are not maybe the best targeted for this group of students. The teachers might be very effective at helping these students in ways that just don't show up on test scores. So it's not that I have a great answer for it, right? But I think you're right that it's counterintuitive. But I think that it could be that it's just these are teachers who are really good, but not on the skill set that we're able to measure.
Okay, let me call the online. If you have a question, go to chat or turn on your camera so we see that you want to ask something. And now we'll go on collecting questions here. But we are getting to the end, so this is one of the last questions, please.
Okay, it was not that much related to your research, but you were mentioning the certification of the teachers.
Yes.
Who certifies them?
In the U.S.,
Institution.
yeah, in the U.S., the teachers have to get certified. Usually, it's the state governments, and usually they have to take a certain number of college credits in certain courses. Sometimes they have to pass a state-based exam. But I think for this type of certification, I'm not sure there's usually an exam. I think it's mostly just you have to take a certain type of amount of courses.
Double question to make a line.
Sorry, just quickly, I wanted to ask if you also look at the funding that the schools receive, because in the US, the funding mostly works based on the district that the parents are, right? So maybe this is why there could be a higher effect for minority groups that come.
I'm sorry, I missed the first part of your question. What was it?
If you also look at funding.
Oh, if I look at
of the
funding.
schools that they,
Yeah.
the students are initially from. Because maybe this could be the reason why the minority groups perform better at the gifted programs, simply because the new school or the new program.
Oh, in the Ohio study? Yeah.
Their previous school did.
I did not in the Ohio study. I did not look at funding. I think most of these students were not necessarily switching schools. They were kind of but they are in different schools. And I think you're right. You're absolutely right that the schools that they would tend to be in, because there is a lot of funding inequity, they would tend to be because they're lower SES students, they would tend to be in lower resource schools. So that's absolutely, I think, a contributor to it. Sure, yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the place. To moreover continue on that, when Daniel was talking about 8-year or 6-year gymnasiums in Czechia, what is also like a problem I thought about now is that those types of schools get students here easily because they are like the most wanted, and so they are actually in the Czech system most of the time the most conservative and the least prone to change and to improve themselves. And they actually, the teachers that teach there, they don't have to have any special certification for working with the talented kids. And it's both argumented that the 8-year gymnasiums are for the talented kids. So I also wanted to ask about the certificates for the teachers, because you said that they really don't have like much of an impact. And I wanted to ask if you think so, like, why is that?
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to imply. Yeah, I didn't mean to imply that that they didn't have much of it. I think we don't know what the impact is. I would say yeah, I don't think we have good evidence on the impact of gifted certification. There are other teacher certification things, at least in the U.S., where general teacher certifications don't seem to matter all that much. But I haven't seen any good studies about gifted teacher certifications.
So if like they don't seem to matter in general, like why do you think? Why personally?
Oh, why in general?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I think that there's probably a lot of stuff that's taught because they're pretty much all taught. Certifications are based on kind of what's taught in the students in their college degrees, right? They're doing in their college courses. I think at least in U.S. Education programs, there's a lot of stuff that's taught in college courses that don't really necessarily translate into improving classroom outcomes. And I'm not so sure that's, necessarily intentional. There's certainly some things that are kind of like, yeah, I don't know why teachers are learning this. I don't think that's actually intentional. I think it's just that a lot of teaching is learning by doing. I think a lot of it's more, and we see this over and over again in a lot, that the one observed factor that seems to matter more than anything else in teaching is experience, and particularly having at least 3 to 5 years of experience under the belt. Like those first few years of experience as a teacher, that's where your growth comes from. It's not even so much what you do at school. And it's funny because I feel like I've lived that. It's like as a professor, I don't know how many people here. There are a few people here who are PhD students. Like, do they actually teach you how to teach here? Exactly, right? No, PhD students never get taught how to teach. I'm like, maybe if you're a PhD student in education, I don't know. So I had no teaching class, nothing about oh, this is how you teach. I think maybe there was like a one-day seminar for how to be a TA or something. So all of my teaching that I learned was from experience. Now, granted, K-12 teachers are supposedly taught how to teach. I'm not so sure it matters all that much, except because I think like 80-90% of how being a good teacher is just learning by doing it. And I think that's probably part of the explanation for why.
Yeah, it's funny that you're mentioning that because I'm actually going to organize an event regarding the teaching methods of teachers on the Charles University.
Oh, great! Yeah, there you go. Teach some of these students how to teach. Yes.
We have a similar problem regarding preparing teachers, like universities, that it's very focused on. I have many friends who study in pedagogical faculties. It's very focused on the curriculum.
Yeah.
They will teach more than
how to do it. Yeah.
Teach the psychology and those things that will actually help them even more. Even more here in Czechia when we have diverse classrooms, which both the talented and the less well-off students need special attention.
Definitely, this is big topic for another lecture like this in the future. And we know also extremely little about how certification helps or whether it helps. So. Okay, so let me call for last question if there is any. We are very silent online today, so fortunately we have very active local.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask, so I grew up kind of in this system in America, the tracking system. I was just gonna ask how common it is for these I guess talented and gifted certifications for teachers, because I never came across it. So I'm just kind of questioning how common it is, and if it's just more common in more urban areas, as well as if there's any kind of effects with kind of the degradation of the required certifications for teachers with teacher shortages recently. Just there's a lot of requirements being kind of waived nowadays in different states. So.
Yeah, no, unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know how common it is. I think it's probably one of the less common certifications that you see, in part because I don't think there's much incentive to do it. I think you're right. A lot of times GT teachers are just teachers who, and often I think they're kind of the more experienced and, presumably sometimes better teachers are the ones who kind of get picked, or, you're right, the teachers want to teach the more advanced students usually, and so they kind of, the ones who are more experienced tend to get picked more, but I don't know how common these certifications are, but I do think they're less common than, say, for example, special ed certifications or things like that. So what was the second part of your question? I forgot.
The second part was just if there's any more recent effects on.
Oh, with the emergency teachers and stuff like that. Generally, I think it's not too clear. I mean, there's something, extracting away from the GT. There's some things like kind of the Teach for America program, which is this program for having not yet certified teachers who are but are kind of advanced college college students who did well teach in in underserved schools, and I think that has a pretty good reputation for what it found. But other than that, I don't think there's I haven't seen that much looking at these specific certifications, emergency certifications. That's not true. I think there's stuff out there. Let me rephrase. There's stuff out there. I'm not too familiar with it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Last technical notes. All who are here are welcome for a small refreshment here. We'll stay with you so we can continue in bilateral discussions. The lecture is being recorded, I hope, and after some cuts, it will be made available. Those who are interested to get notification emails about the news from Talent and or other research agendas of IDEA, please send us an email. We'll be happy informing you. And finally, I'd like to thank our dear guest, Professor Scott
Imberman, yes.
Imberman, for his great lecture, which is very inspiring for the Czech environment. I hope in a number of years or a decade we'll get to the level of US understanding of these issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you.